The remote work and worker wellbeing in the post-COVID-19 era event. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the event today. We're really pleased to introduce a number of speakers today, a number of panelists in the event from both the University of Birmingham and beyond. I'll be your host, if you like, for the day. My name's Daniel Wheatley. I am a reader in business and labour economics at the University of Birmingham Business School. My area of focus for my research is in wellbeing at work and in flexible working. So obviously the events of the last 8 or so months have been very interesting, to say the least, in terms of developments in our understanding and experiences of work, and in where we think work will move into the future. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Professor Irene Hardle from Northumbria University, from the Department of Social Policy, who will give us a more formal introduction to the session titled Remote Work and Worker Wellbeing in the post-COVID-19 era.
Thank you, Dan. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this joint ESRC Festival of Social Science and Work Inclusivity Research Centre, University of Birmingham event. This webinar has the specific aim of generating debate and discussion around the multifaceted realities of the rapid expansion currently being witnessed around the globe in remote working. Today, we are holding a webinar, but had we been meeting as part of the Festival of Social Science just a year ago in 2019, we would have been meeting face-to-face in Birmingham. But the reality of COVID-19 means that so many aspects of our professional lives have changed, from where we undertake paid work, how we convene workshops and conferences, how we teach, etc. This is a mixed blessing. It has changed the spatial and temporal pattern of paid work. Working from home has taken on new meanings. Today in England, we are in our second lockdown, and it is appropriate that we critically reflect on the new lived reality. And our speakers will look forward to the post-pandemic world of work. Will we build back better? So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, Nick Owen, Chairman of Deloitte LLP, who will speak to the future of work and wellbeing, an industry perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you, Daniel. And I think great that you've organised this this discussion this afternoon. I think this is going to be a massively important conversation for society at large, but particularly for business over the next few months, as the pandemic has already had a huge impact on working lives and lots of other people's lives outside of the workplace, but also poses, I think, some much bigger questions for businesses as we consider how to organise ourselves going forwards. So this afternoon, I thought I would cover a couple of things. Firstly, our experience of the initial lockdown as a firm, what we did to ourselves, which is 20% of the story, and really how we supported our clients during that period, which is probably about 80% of our impact. I'll also talk a little bit about how I think one will go about navigating the new normal and the interplay between work, workers, and the workplace. And looking ahead, what might be some of the ongoing challenges and the need to create both a sense of belonging in a distributed world, but also to deal with some of the issues around wellness and well-being. So I could turn to the next slide, please. Our experience of the lockdown was, I suspect, compared to some organisations, was pretty good. We are a global organisation, so we had eyes on what was going on in Asia through the early part of the year and the end of last year. So we were running client webinars and seminars during February, talking to our Chinese colleagues about how they were dealing with the pandemic there, and what their clients were doing and what they were fearing. So we felt quite well prepared for it, and we were also lucky in that we're a pretty agile organisation. We'd we call it agile working, but this is a concept of balancing work with your other needs in life, whether they're caring or family or other responsibilities. And so we did have 20,000 people in the UK who all had a laptop and a mobile phone and were quite used to using them from multiple different places during the working week. So actually the transition was relatively easy for us, and it was fairly easy for us to stay connected to our clients and to keep working and supporting them. But the real challenge for us very quickly became focused on our own people and well-being, and that's something we learned from Asia, and we quickly got onto it here. And creating a way that you could have a dialogue with them about people feeling very anxious about the world they were living in, not just that they were working remotely. It was what was going to happen to the world, what was going to happen to their loved ones, how much risk was there, et cetera, et cetera. So we focused a lot on that quite quickly, I think. In terms of what we did with our clients, we were also trying to help them in the same period, whether that was looking at their underlying liquidity, whether they could withstand whatever shocks were going to come from a business perspective, what it meant for their own workforces and their supply chains and their customers. We're doing a lot of human capital work in those periods, sort of helping people with workforce management, particularly those that weren't actually particularly used to agile working. And of course, there are some organizations that couldn't be agile. A lot of blue collar workers needed to work where they work, and dealing with those, and also dealing in hybrid organizations where they might have had a large amount of their workforce who were key workers, frontline workers, grocery trade, for example, but also another section of their workers that are office workers. How do you deal with those challenges of one rule for one rule for the other, and how you actually help people through those transitions? In terms of, if you could just turn to the next slide, I think one of the things Daniel, can you turn to the next slide? Sorry. One of the things we've sort of thought about here is how we think about the workforce and the workplace. So we're definitely looking now, both ourselves, but also looking outward for our clients, thinking about how will those interplay. So what do we mean by work? What sort of tasks need to get done under work? What does that mean for the workforce? People have been worrying about the workforce and digitization and replacing humans with technology, but actually what we see is a world where technology will be a much bigger part, and you'll get the humans to do something slightly different. But also, what does it mean for the workplace? Because clearly there's many organizations, ours included, that never expected all of our people to be in the office, but we were sized for a certain number of our people to be in the office, and that will not go back to being the same as it was, nor do I believe or personally hope it will stay where it is at the moment, because although we're proving we can work very effectively remotely, I'm not sure we would all choose to work that way going forwards. So we've done quite a lot of work on that, and maybe that will come up in the Q&A in terms of those different experiences. And if you could just go to the next slide as well. What we're doing with our clients is really, and it's quite early days for many of them, but this is really understanding the strategy for them of how they're starting to think about the workplace and what they need to provide in terms of office construct or support functions for creative components of their workforce, for collaborative components, and just for a place to go and be at work together with colleagues. Now that is proving interesting, and again, I think we're much more conscious, and certainly in a profession like ours, we're very cognizant of. We are lucky enough to have the people who work for us as long as they choose to work for us. And we have to go on being an attractive place for them to work because they've got quite a lot of mobility. Not necessarily the case in every organisation, but I think how we come at this question from how much office space do we need versus what sort of working environment do our people want? Because I think that is where we will come from much more, is how do our people want to work? What are the components of the work that they have? And how do they like to configure that? And what would work for them will be driving a lot of our decisions. But for some clients, it will be a different mix of those. So just if I go back now to the final slide, a few closing remarks. And again, very happy to pick up on some of this stuff under Q&A. I think for us looking forward, we do see a much more hybrid world going forward. Our most recent human capital report survey showed that well-being, belonging were going to be two of the most important trends in how organizations thought about how they organize and deploy their people. Cultivating a sense of belonging in a hybrid model is going to be quite difficult, I think. I mean, I always have that horrible mental model of a conference call meeting that you used to join when 6 people were in the room and 4 weren't, and the 4 that weren't in the room were not only not in the room, they weren't really in the conversation. And I think the same is true with the format we're using today, and video conferencing. It's very easy when everyone is out and remote and dialing in, but in a world which is hybrid, that could be a bit more difficult. And I also think being much more clear and clinical about what roles do you want to do and need to do with others, and which do you prefer to do and want to do in isolation. So that is a big piece of it. Now, well-being is still there for us as a pretty major component, and I think it's going to be interesting. Certainly our experience and our clients' experience over the last 2 or 3 weeks since the rule of 6 and then the further lockdown was introduced. I think some of the anxiety levels in the organisation, in our people and in our clients, has definitely gone up, and it's gone up to a higher level than we left it as we came out of the last lockdown. So I think the uncertainty about how long it's going to go on for, the time of year that people are experiencing it, and frankly, any novelty factor that some people did have about working remotely before is, I think, well and truly gone for some of them. There are, however, a group of other people who are very positive about it, and I think looking at ways to make sure you've segmented your people so that whether they're people who are actually really struggling with anxiety and mental health issues in this, or are just anxious, some who are thriving in it, and others who are just learning to cope with it, but it's not ideal. And I suspect most organizations have got people in all 3 states. So I think I'll leave it there, let the other speakers speak, and then come back and delve into detail under Q&A, if that's all right, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Brilliant. Thanks for those insights. That's excellent. So I will now hand over. I'll now hand over to Sophie Sinclair, who is from the Lloyds Banking Group Centre for Responsible Business at the University of Birmingham.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good. Thanks, Nick. That was really interesting. And I think, as well as I'm engagement and operations lead for the Lloyds Banking Group Centre for Responsible Business, which is part of the business school, but I'm also co-lead with Dan of our College of Social Sciences Wellbeing Task Force. Now, this was an idea that was created a couple of years ago when we were seeing a real need within the College of Social Sciences that people wanted more wellbeing support and were identifying areas where they were looking for it. So we came up with this idea of a task force. And if you go on to the next slide. And you can see there what our strategy was. And it was quite a simple strategy because it was a group of volunteers. But for us, it was a little bit different in that we wanted it to be research influence, because as a large institution that is research based and much of our knowledge capital is around our research, it's quite surprising how often that doesn't feed into our own policies and practices. And I think most people who've worked in the university environment are aware of, there's almost a doctors and nurses divide in some areas, a bit like hospitals, in that there are professional services staff and there are academic staff. And we've always been very keen to try and break that down and have much more of an authentic engagement between the two groups, but also to co-create more of what we do. We've got some fantastic intellectual capital in research and teaching and want to feed those into our operations more and what happens within there. So 2 years ago, we set some objectives around this and started to devise a series of activities and events, largely run by volunteers and representatives from the college itself, but to start getting people talking more about their wellbeing and more engaged with the whole agenda. I think we can safely say, Dan, it was hugely successful at the start. And now looking back, we had 12 months of bliss. We were all on campus. It was very simple in those old, simpler times. And I think it's important to weave into that. One of our challenges at that point was we have a hugely diverse group of staff. So within that staff group, within the College of Social Sciences, you've got senior professors, you've got lecturers who are teaching on a regular basis, you've got staff who are purely research based, so largely working often off campus, from staff who are working in catering and cleaning and all sorts. So we've got a really broad, diverse group of staff to cater for. So at that point, we had 12 very successful months, and we're looking forward to learning from what we've done so far and taking those forward. And then COVID happened. And I think for both me and Dan, it was, and the rest of the group, it was a huge challenge to then understand that wellbeing had suddenly gone even higher up the agenda for everybody and had become of paramount importance. And I think for us, looking at shifting the delivery of our activities and support to online, alongside the increasing pressure and uncertainty, not just for individuals and their home lives, but I think around business operations in general. We've got staff who are funded by research. I'm funded by Lloyds Banking Group at the moment as part of our research centre. We had staff on different contracts. And I think that understanding how to react to those changing needs for us was a huge challenge. Do you want to go on to the next slide? Sorry, I should have a little sign for that, like click. We did manage to successfully move the majority of our activity to online, which was no mean feat. And the one thing that we became really aware of was the disengagement of people and the lack of connectivity because of working remotely. And I think lockdown combined with remote working really, and all of the challenges and pressures that people were facing as individuals, really made it even more important for us to be able to communicate successfully and find a way to bring people together online. And I think alongside that challenge, one of the other problems was people were really becoming all zoomed out and very tired of looking at screens. So it was a way of engaging people differently. So I wanted to just highlight one of the areas. I should have pointed out on the last slide, our whole university ethos and what we've built our wellbeing strategy on is around the 5 ways to wellbeing. And 2 of those that were really key in this, that have worked surprisingly well for us during this period, has been around the power of giving and connecting and people volunteering. And Irene, I know this is an area of your work as well, around volunteering, but quite surprising how keen people were to engage with these strategies and to actually give more and connect more. So 3 things just as a top line that we did, and I'm happy to give more information on this post-event. I know we're going to do Q&A at the end. We've got lots of web content on this as well that we can share. The strategies that we devised have all been aiming to connect with wider agendas. So for us, 3 of those things that we did, we set up a volunteering scheme, and this was in partnership with Lloyds Banking Group, but also with a charity called Entrade. And this is a charity who support new refugees to the UK. So the person who set up Entrade is an alumnus of our university. He was also a refugee himself. And this volunteering scheme gave our colleagues, both from the College of Social Sciences and Lloyds, the opportunity to offer telephone support to these refugees. So I think thinking about the barriers that these people were facing and the challenges that they had, it gave our colleagues not only the opportunity to network with colleagues from our partner organisation, but to really start to understand some of the issues that this group were facing, which also translated back into their work. So for Lloyds, lots of these people work with customers who are part of this group. From our College of Social Sciences, it's an area of teaching and research. And it also has enabled us to talk about more of our research in this area, which is a key area for us. We also did a big fundraising initiative over August. So domestic violence was one of the areas that we knew was on the rise during lockdown and is a significant issue. It's also an area that we research in social sciences, and something that we teach in across the college as well. And it's also something, quite honestly, that we know as an institution we don't talk about enough. And I think there is something, especially in traditional institutions that are quite hierarchical, that there isn't an honest and authentic narrative about some of these things that doesn't help the issue. So what we decided to do was, alongside the wellbeing and trying to help people get out more, we set up something called our Fabulous 40 fundraiser. We always like a good bit of alliteration with these. And we encouraged people to do either 40 kilometres over August in any way that they wanted to, or 40 minutes of another activity to fundraise. We raised over £2,000 during this time for Birmingham and Solihull Women's Aid, but probably more or equally importantly, we raised so much awareness of an issue, and it encouraged so much honest conversation with other people around their own experiences, and just thanks from people about raising awareness. And it also got our colleagues out. So you can see some of our colleagues here getting out and about and working together. And again, great engagement activity. And the third one I wanted to just briefly touch on was, from the very start, we started something and we called it College of Social Sciences at Home. And it was people from all walks of life in the college telling their personal stories and what had affected them during lockdown. And it was a really authentic voice from some very senior staff down to all sorts of staff throughout the college, just telling their stories at home and how they were coping. And that had a huge impact on people, lots of great feedback and lots of engagement again. Thanks, Dan. So I think for us, I just wanted to highlight some of the wider wins that came from us as an institution around the wellbeing and prioritising it. And I think building those colleague networks internally and externally was a real key one for this. Raising the awareness of our research and its impact and tying it in. I think in lots of big institutions, you do tend to work in silos in some areas, and actually people understanding how what they're doing feeds into the bigger picture is so key to employee engagement. It enabled more of an authentic employee voice and development for staff. It enabled engagement for our staff working remotely. Importantly for us as an institution as well, it helped us to achieve our civic mission and improve our equality, diversity and inclusion. And it affirmed and communicated our college values. I think in most organisations, we're incredibly good at writing policies and telling people what we're about. We're not always as good at authentically making sure that happens on the ground and hearing that employee voice. And I think it increased our engagement and trust. So for me, really, to close, I would just say for us, it's really shown the value of wellbeing and people investing in wellbeing, but also giving that authentic voice to the wellbeing. And for us, as part of a wellbeing strategy, we will certainly be looking at building more on our giving and connecting with the community.
Thank you, Sophie. That was excellent. So I shall now hand over to Professor Mark Saunders, who's a Professor of Business Research Methods and co-leader of the Trust Research Team in the Work Inclusivity Research Centre at the University of Birmingham.
Okay, thanks very much for the intro, Dan, and also thanks for the invitation to partake. I'd like to stress that this is work which I've been doing with a good friend, Colin Hughes, who's at the Technical University in Dublin. So it's really a joint paper in terms of presentation, in terms of where the work comes from. I'd also like to say thanks to Sophie for giving me a really nice segue in and finishing up with engagement and trust. It was obviously very carefully planned. In terms of what I want to talk about over the next few minutes is I obviously need a little bit about what we mean by trust, and then I want to look at remote working and virtual teams, why trust is important. So in effect, the business case for trust and looking at what research has told us, and then how trust develops, and then what leaders in virtual teams can do, both to show that they trust those that in their teams, but also to enable trust within their team. So looking at two different aspects of that. And so with no further ado, Dan, can you do your clicky bit, please? So we're going to have, my slides have got multiple clicky bits in, which means I've got to make sure that Dan actually pays attention all the way through. He can't go to sleep, so that's quite helpful for him. So just initially starting off with the trust, and we're talking about an act of doing something. So it's actively trusting means you've got to become vulnerable, and you're only doing that because you think the other person's expectations are positive to you. So you don't think you're going to have any harm come to yourself. And when we start to remote work, this need to show that you trust someone else and also to show that you're worthy of being trusted becomes even more important because there's less obvious connections. Click, please, Dan. So if we start, he's done me 4 clicks at once. If we start off with the one on the right, this is sort of trust in a normal world. So it's outside a coffee shop in Vancouver when I was there a few years ago, and it just shows about this idea of being benevolent and caring within trust and being grateful to people who you're working with. We then move across to the other side and we see a can of beer, but the name of it gives a clue as to why this is it shows how trust is important. It's about people having integrity as well. So it's being benevolent, it's having integrity, and it's about actually being trusted. So the top picture is of somebody who I think has been in the news a fair bit recently. But the issue there is what we find is that the trust in Donald Trump about looking after America in terms of handling the COVID cases runs at 33%, which again is quite interesting. And then moving down, we then have something which has started to hit the news big time in terms of trust of people working at home. And is it right that some organisations are actually using technology to actually see whether people are doing work when they're logged into their machines? So, for example, the camera which you can see me on could be showing that I'm actually working, and an organisation could be coming in. Is that there, or should we be trusting people? So it's starting to raise a whole lot of new issues in terms of how we trust and how are people trustworthy. Click. When we start to look at remote working, I think the first thing to say, and this is sort of emphasised a little bit by Nick, is that remote working has been going on for a very long time. What we've actually seen with COVID is a rapid acceleration in the numbers of people doing it and the fact that people are doing it more rather than just doing it occasionally. So it's sort of been a ramping up of it. And it's working outside or away from the organisation's main place of work. And so we could be working at home, but we could be working away from home and away from the main workplace. There's a variety of different ways of doing so. And if we click again, please, Dan. We then have virtual teams, and like remote working, this happens in a variety of ways. People can be culturally dispersed, they can be geographically dispersed, it can be temporary, it can be permanent. They can be collaboration on one project, on a variety of projects, and so on. So what we actually see with this idea of virtual teams, we have teams which are fully virtual, so people never actually meet face to face. And then we have at the very far end, teams who are co-located but still work as if they're virtual teams. So they may actually be in the same building, but actually working virtually and communicating with each other via the technology. I mean, certainly I used to see my own children communicating with each other on Facebook, sitting in the same room. So it obviously does happen. But this has major implications for trust and how leaders enable and work with their teams to build a trusting team. Because what we find is that people will be, if they're in the same building, they actually have a greater access to the leader as a face-to-face thing and also to their colleagues. If we can click again, please. Trust is really crucial though. I mean, we talked a lot about in the past about it shaping positive relationships and having a positive impact. But there's a fantastic article in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago, which actually looked at the top 25% of companies that said that their employees said they felt trusted in. And in these companies, the employees were 76% more engaged, 50% more productive, enjoyed their jobs more, 60%, and were more likely to recommend the company. So I think that's a pretty strong argument saying if you develop a trusting relationships, it has big impacts. When we sort of start to focus down on virtual teams, we find that trust improves the effectiveness of the team. Again, we see people being more satisfied for working in those teams, and the teams themselves are more cohesive, and within them, team members more committed to each other. So it's almost like trust is a glue bonding or sticking it together, and it's that emotional link that builds the team. So what we're seeing is that trust actually starts to overcome that physical distance of actually getting together with each other, and therefore it's pretty crucial to create this climate of trust within teams and actually enable people to be both trusting of each other but also to be trustworthy. So it's like we have a two-way type relationship there, and the trust is reciprocated. And next slide, please, Dan. So how does trust develop? This is from work by Mayer Davis and Allen, but I think it's really helpful. We have three main ways of looking at trust. We trust somebody in terms of their ability, how good they are actually doing something in terms of their skills and judgment. We trust them in terms of their integrity. So do they have strong values which actually are the same as or very close to my own values as a trustee? And we also trust people in terms of their benevolence. Do they really care about me? So that we can see issues, how well-being can be part of this to a certain extent. And those together start to enable trust, but there are other things that start to impact on this. Dan, a click, please. And that is the person who's doing the trusting, their ability or their propensity to trust. Some people are just generally more trustworthy than others, and other people never trust anybody. And so that's obviously going to have an impact. And it's also about the risk of actually making that leap to trust. If I trust somebody, I've made a mistake, what's the impact going to be on me? So we have a risk-taking relationship, and then we have something which sort of moves around, and more trust moves more trust. You're thinking ahead for me, thank you. Karen, do click it across, that's fine. So I'd now like to look at the behaviours that leaders take or can take to enable trust. And this comes from the work that Colin and I have been doing in particular. So we start off looking at how leaders demonstrate their trustworthiness as a trustee. So they're saying to their team members, you can trust me. And or showing that, and when they demonstrate that, it hopefully increases the members' perceptions of their trustworthiness, and they therefore trust the leaders, and they exhibit trusting behaviours. If we can click again, Dan. And what we found is a variety of actions by leaders can demonstrate trustworthiness. So things like supporting team members, protecting them from other people, having their back, and also adding value to themselves in the way they do the job, but also in terms of developing them into the future in relation to career coaching. It's about providing information about what's going on, and also being open enough to say, I don't know what's going on. It's about communicating the agenda into the future, and it's also about availability, and in virtual teams, ensuring that they are available. And so even though they may be the other side of the world, there is a perceived proximity because they know they can get through a Zoom call or a phone call, they can still get the support. And it's being open to criticisms as well. If we now look at, click please, Dan. If we now look at the way leaders can demonstrate their trust of team members, we can actually see the same sort of cycle working round. If we click on the left-hand side, click again, Dan, please. We see how openness is crucial also in demonstrating that they are trusting of their members. So open in terms of, I will tell you these things. Open in saying, I'll give you the autonomy to get on with the work, and I won't be looking at you the whole time. If you think back to my first slide where I had the picture of somebody home working, once you start to monitor people to that extent, you're reducing demonstration autonomy, and you're really saying, I do not trust you. And it's also about showing the value and respect that you have for the team members as a leader. Click please again, Dan. So where does this leave us? Basically, from the work Colin and I have been doing, and from other research as well, very much this trust is the glue which connects remote workers together in DTs and also remote workers with their leaders. So it's the glue of the teams. DT leaders, so team leaders, is crucial to this remote working in terms of trust. And it's based on their perceived ability, integrity and benevolence, and that builds over time. And what we've found is that in many teams, ability is taken for granted, and it's issues of integrity and in particular benevolence that are crucial. And quite often a benevolent leader can actually overcome other problems because they're seen to care. And I think that's important to remember. The other thing we found is that leaders can help build trust by demonstrating that as trustors, they trust their DT members. And they can also help build trust by demonstrating they're trustworthy as well. So in other words, this reciprocity is absolutely crucial. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. That's brilliant. So I'll now hand over to someone who I feel like I've known all my life. That's because I have. It's my sister, Dr. Sarah Buglis from the Department of Psychology at Nottingham Trent University.
Thank you, Dan. That's quite an introduction. Hi everyone, my name, as Dan said, is Dr. Sarah Buglis. I'm a principal lecturer at Nottingham Trent University, where my research interests include social and cyberpsychology. So my particular kind of research focus tends to be on problematic online behaviours. So you can normally put a tagline to my research with, and then things go wrong. But I also look at perceptions of online risk, the fear of missing out, and most recently, problematic interactions looking around banter. In my role as principal lecturer, I also lead on projects to support the digitising of the psychology department. So as you can imagine, in recent months, I've been extremely busy as we've kind of moved everything online. So I've seen firsthand how some of the research that myself and some of the other members of our department have done into kind of how people interact online has kind of come to play within these kind of digital environments that we're all now using. So today I'm going to talk to you about the topic of cyber collisions in a socially distant world, and I'll be drawing on social and cyber psychological research to highlight some of the potential psychosocial challenges that might be associated with remote working. Next slide, please, Dan. So as social beings, we all need, and employees as well, need to be connected with others. We need to feel that connection. Maintaining positive workplace social relationships can help individuals to stay engaged, promote positive attitudes and productivity, and it can also have very much positive implications for employee well-being. Being able to talk to and interact with others, whether it be in a formal meeting or just in passing when you're grabbing a coffee or next to the photocopier, can provide much needed social and informational support. And above all, it can satisfy our need for belonging. It can make us feel part of a team, part of the organisation. However, in a socially distant world where many are unable to meet in person, people have found themselves having to maintain their workplace connections online via things like email, through platforms such as Zoom, as we're on now, or Microsoft Teams, connecting with each other via social media, so keeping up with people in terms of like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, using messaging apps such as WhatsApp, or even using customizable online environments such as GatherTown to kind of hold virtual coffee breaks where you can make little avatars of yourself. In fact, there are a myriad of digital opportunities to connect and interact both asynchronously and synchronously. But with opportunity, there often comes risk. And when it comes to social communication, the risk can lie in the way we self-present ourselves to different people in our networks, our social spheres. Next slide, please, Dan. So in the offline world, our social networks are made up of multiple social spheres. We interact and communicate with different people, often at different times and in different contexts. And as such, our spheres tend to be linked to role identity. So for instance, I might have spheres that reflect my role as a friend, I might have spheres that reflect my role as a family member or my role as a colleague. And equally, these might go further. For instance, in my workplace, my social spheres might reflect my role as a team member, my role as a line manager, and my role in the wider organisation. So these role identities that we have are important basically because they frame expectations. They frame the expectations that we have of others, but equally they frame the expectations that other people have of us. And as such, our role identities help to inform our behavioural judgments. So many of us will consider who we're interacting with and where we're interacting, and we'll use that information to adapt our behaviour to suit. Now, offline, this is something that we can control relatively easily. So we can see the people that we're interacting with, we can pick up on their visual and auditory cues, and the interactions that are generally taking place in contextually appropriate places. So we kind of look to the context and it helps to guide us and therefore moderate our communication to suit both the audience, but also the context in which we're in. So for instance, I might behave and communicate very differently, for instance, when I'm talking to my sons at home, and I can hear one has just walked in behind me, so apologies if my door opens in a moment. But I would speak to them very differently in the home environment than I would when I'm speaking to my boss at work, for instance. So we use that kind of contextual information and we use those cues to help us moderate our behaviours. Next slide, please, Dan. However, when our interactions take place online, we actually run the risk of experiencing what we call contextual collapse. And this is where we have situations in which we experience a blurring of social boundaries. So in cyberpsychology research, we often see this occurring when we think about social media users, particularly on platforms such as Facebook, where people are adding lots of different individuals from a whole host of different social spheres into one very much largely flat social structure. So you end up with a situation where people, information and social norms of different social spheres are kind of coming together in one large social melting pot. Everyone's kind of residing in that same context. Now, for remote workers, the potential for contextual collapse is also present. So aside from the potential issues of connecting to and interacting with work colleagues on contextually collapsed social media platforms, so it's quite possible that we connect with our work colleagues on, say, Facebook and things like that. But aside from that, we're also remote workers are also potentially facing a distinct blurring of kind of the contextual boundaries between home and work. Home and work effectively collide, where people's personal and professional roles come together. Now, I'm sure we've all witnessed this in recent months, and I'm sure we've all commented on people's bookcases, their homes in the background. And we've also seen people kind of switching from their work self, kind of trying to maintain a very professional kind of atmosphere, but at the same time, we'll see them suddenly flick to their home self as they get interrupted by a pet or kind of a child or a kind of another family member. So we can kind of see where those two environments are very much colliding. Interestingly, though, some of the online work contexts themselves, so it's not just a case of the idea that people can see into your home. Some of the actual context, the digital context that we're using at work could prevent a contextual collapse issue. Particularly where some organisations are maybe adopting all staff virtual team spaces, for instance, or hosting large scale online meetings where you've got people from across lots of different levels of an organisation or department kind of coming together and mingling in one space. So in these circumstances, the lack of clear social and contextual boundaries, coupled with a potential lack of visual cues, can make it potentially difficult to not only imagine who you're communicating with, but also to gauge kind of how to interact and how you should behave and the types of communication you should be sharing. And it could, in a similar fashion to how we see on social media, result in the potential for social and workplace tension and potential vulnerability and kind of well-being consequences. Next slide, please, Dan. So why do these blurred boundaries promote social tension in online remote contexts? Well, when we communicate online, there is likely to be increased visibility of our interactions. So both within a particular social sphere, but also between the different social spheres that we're interacting with, as the platforms we tend to use will show all sorts of communication that is going on kind of all together and all at once. This can lead to increases in both unwanted but also unintended communications, as typically we don't want to actually talk to everyone or interact with everyone all at once. We want to approach our communications in very much a segmented way. So the affordances of the technology therefore often result in the communications being visible to many more people than you would ideally have them directed to in the offline world, where we would generally kind of moderate and segment how we would interact. It's also worth noting, though, that the communications that we're having in these online working environments are very much persistent. They don't necessarily just disappear. In the offline world, a workplace faux pas or a slip of the tongue can be over in moments and kind of forgotten. You can kind of move on. But online, it can persist. It can be very much visible. It can be replicated and shared. And in some circumstances, it can even be searched for. Importantly, this means that communications are open to scrutiny, but also judgment by others. So a problematic interaction, something that you've shared inadvertently, maybe it wasn't meant for other people, a source of potential social tension can actually linger and create potential psychosocial vulnerability for the individuals, but also those within their network with whom they're connecting. So research that we've conducted into online social spheres and problematic interactions online has actually highlighted that contextually collapsed virtual contexts, such as some of the ones that we're currently using while working remotely, but also very much the ones that we use kind of socially, tend to be particularly sensitive to things like social tension and vulnerabilities, particularly when we put them in the context of people oversharing personal information. And I'm sure we've all seen it if we've got kind of large kind of departmental spaces at the moment. I know we have a particular kind of departmental space where people are sharing lots of things that are potentially quite highly personal about kind of their day-to-day activities, what they're having for lunch and things like that. So this oversharing of personal information can make them very sensitive to kind of these vulnerabilities. But also there's much more capacity for people to actually engage in what we call emotionally charged disclosures, where they might suddenly have a rant or kind of express themselves in a particularly emotional way. But it's also sensitive to the use of banter between colleagues. And this is a particular pet project of mine at the moment, looking at kind of banter in online domains. And research that we've recently had accepted for publication that looks into this topic of banter in kind of different online contexts suggests that the perceived intent of banter can actually be difficult to engage in contextually collapsed spaces. So if you have employees engaging in potentially in-jokes or trying to share kind of humorous memes and GIFs and things like that, it can sometimes be very difficult to kind of gauge whether it's actually a joke or something more problematic, because the lack of shared social norms, the lack of potential understanding, coupled with the lack of visibility, coupled with the visibility of the interactions, but the lack of social kind of and visual cues can render it difficult for people to actually accurately perceive the intent. Next slide. So how can we maintain social boundaries, but importantly, stay connected when remote working in a socially distant world? Well, one option is for us to make use of the technological affordances themselves. So that could be, for instance, looking at the platforms to see how we can group individuals, assign privacy permissions, which like we do, we can do this on social platforms, we can do it on Teams, we can prevent wide-scale contextual collapse by things like creating specific groups that might be specific to particular audiences and purposes. We could even prevent information from the home inadvertently bleeding into the context of work by using things as simple as virtual backgrounds in online meetings, so people can't actually see what's going on behind you. In fact, there's lots of steps that the technology platforms offer us that will help people to actually take this kind of element of social control and protect themselves and kind of put these boundaries in place. But it's also worth remembering that why having kind of social control is really important. It's also shouldn't be at the cost of actually limiting our social connectivity. So as I said at the top of this presentation, we thrive on social connection. We thrive on kind of maintaining that connectivity and kind of discussing with people and having the opportunity to chat and talk about things in both formal and informal spaces. And therefore that shouldn't be ignored. That shouldn't be put to one side in order to maintain these social boundaries. And it's also worth noting that despite our best intentions to maintain social boundaries, to get people to use the technological affordances of the platforms, research on privacy settings, privacy awareness and privacy violations has consistently shown that users of social type platforms with which many of us are engaging both in our kind of social and professional lives now have at best modest user awareness and adoption of settings. So even though the settings are there and they're available, not many people actually make good use of them, because they're not necessarily aware of how to use them well, and therefore they're not necessarily mitigating against the potential pitfalls of contextual collapse. Therefore, going forward, as we kind of potentially move into a world where we'll be working more and more in a kind of remote context and a blended context, having companies kind of draw up clear guidelines for things like information sharing, communication norms, and also technology usage while kind of engaging in those kind of blended and remote environments would definitely be advised. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's brilliant. So we'll now move on to our next speaker, who's Dr. Eric Xu from the University of Birmingham Department of Marketing. I'll hand it over to you, Eric.
Yes, thank you for having me here in this very interesting and important discussion and debate. The topic is remote work-related and non-related work-related job stresses caused by COVID-19. I did a survey in the summertime, about in July this year, on a number of aspects related to the pandemic, and this includes the job stress and also the mental health and also the interpersonal relationship and also about the consumption. And for today's presentation, I picked up just about the job stress part of my survey result and to report here. Next slide, please. Yes, so there are some related literature. For example, the first one is about talking about what's the main reason for job stress. Historically, is usually about the workload. The people having greater workload usually have the greater job stress. But there are also some other factors of the job stress caused by some disaster happening, and the pandemic, of course, is one of the disasters. For example, the second reference is about a study on about the effect of the Hurricane Sandy in America in 2016, and the study find that there is still in the community where the hurricane has affected the community, they still experience the PTSD, which is called post-traumatic stress disorder, still after 1 year after the hurricane. And the last study by Landy in 2004 is about soon after the 9/11 attack in America, and people there, the victims there, were still afraid of the potential job losses and the job security, and they're also mentally stressful a year after the 9/11 attack. So there have been some study linking finding the relationship between the job stress, mental stress, and something happening, such as disaster, such as terrorist attack. The next slide, please. Yes, I find there are some factors through the survey. There are some factors identified as the key factors caused by the pandemic, and then I categorize these factors into two groups. One is caused by the pandemic in general, not related to the remote working, and the other group of the factors are caused by the pandemic, but also related to the remote working. And this slide is about just caused by the pandemic, but not related to remote working. we find that many respondents, these are the three factors that cause them the job stress. The first one is they are concerned about their income. For example, even though they may still keep the job, but will their employer ask them to reduce their income? And we see the footballer, for example, they are asked to self-regulate or self-reduce their income, or also some other occupations. And then also the third one is about some people, of course, they are afraid of the job losses because of the shutdown, and the business is not open. Will they lose their job? And that cause them not to consider the job losses and the income losses, but also mentally is very stressful. And the second one is about, of course, if they go back to work, especially for some jobs, like the key workers and other work and other jobs that require them to go physically to the workplace. They are also, it's very natural for them to be fearful of being exposed to the virus when being called to return to work. So I find these are the three factors mentioned by most of the respondents, the highest number, highest percentage of the people responding to this survey, cite these three are the main factor causing them the mental stress caused by the job. The next slide, please. And also the other group of the factors that is related to the job stress, but also particularly related to the remote work are these two factors. The first one is about people, more and more people are being unable to separate their personal life from work while working from home. For example, I have one PhD student who from South Korea, and he worked at, in the lockdown, and he was forced to work in his accommodation, and he finally found that it's difficult to separate the work and the personal life, and mentally he's very stressful, and he asked us to ask the university to allow him to go back to his home country. So, and then he continued his studies. I just give an example about it's really possible for some people to be unable to manage the separation between the personal life from work when they have to work from home. And the second factor is about the general stress we created by working from home. What can be this general stress? For example, when working at home, and then the home, the place where they are working may be very close to kitchen, very close to the dining table. It's really difficult. Sometimes it's really difficult to separate. I'm not talking about the personal life and the work, which is the first factor. I'm talking about it could interrupt their biological clock. It could make them disrupt their biological clock, and possibly, for example, they may work. If they are working in the physical space in the office, they know, okay, from 5, 6, they are about to go back home. But it's more possible that when I'm working at home, they work until 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m., and then still working, and then forgot to eat, or eat very less, or eat very late, and then it's something eating disorder, and it also can cause the stress, physically some damage, and also psychologically is also stressful. The next slide, please, which is the last slide. Thank you. The last one is about the conclusion. So historically, as I said, one of the key factors affecting the job stress is the workload. But through because of the pandemic, and then we find some new factors of job stress, such as being unable to separate personal life and working life, and also some other general stress caused by working from home. So find some new factors. And if working from home is still the norm or part of the working life in the future, then this new factor could continue in the future, may not be just the temporary factor. The next one is about the mental health. I understand this one, the mental health, the last point is not something particularly new that I'd like to point out. I don't quite many other people already point out this. What I just want to mention is about the pandemic, coronavirus. Of course, a lot of losses, many people die, and also many people lost their jobs, many people lose their income, but also mentally, it's quite possible that the mental health of many people in the country in the long term may be badly affected by the pandemic, whether it is through remote working or not through remote working. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Eric. That's brilliant, and a very useful segue into our next speaker by finishing on mental health, I can hand over to Maureen Smokis, who's a lecturer in the Department of Social Work and Social Care and academic lead for mental health first aid in the College of Social Sciences at the University of Birmingham.
Hi, Dan. Thanks very much for that. And I have to apologise for not having a wonderful PowerPoint presentation. I just want to really, first of all, reinforce what Dan said, that all of these things are really interesting, and I can see how they all fit together. My background is actually I am an academic at the university, but I'm a mental health practitioner by background. And my research has previously been done with newly qualified mental health practitioners looking at their wellbeing and resilience, and continuing to do that through this COVID situation and how we support people through reflective practice and supervision. I'm also a coach in the university and support staff through that medium. So I was really pleased to have the opportunity to become involved with the Wellbeing Task Force and to work alongside people with the mental health first aid. So I just want to point out to people that over the last few years, it's the mental health of staff working in university has been under scrutiny. High numbers of staff have found the work stressful. It's been identified that increasing numbers of staff have been referred to counselling and to occupational health. And so prior to COVID-19, it was decided by the College of Social Sciences that there would be a number of staff trained in mental health first aid using Mental Health First Aid England model. And this model has been used in a number of universities, and it's been used in different ways. So I'm going to tell you something about how we're using it in the College of Social Sciences at the university. Prior to COVID, it was already identified that 1 in 4 people will experience some form of mental health issue in any year, and that 1 in 6 working age adults will have symptoms associated with mental ill health. So, for instance, disturbed sleep, fatigue, etc. They may not meet the criteria for diagnosis, however, people are still experiencing those symptoms. So, as I said earlier, there have been increasing numbers of people being referred to counselling and to occupational health. In some universities, this increase has been up to 300%. And I did say 300%. So it's high numbers of staff. That's academics and professional services staff being referred to those services. I want to emphasise that ordinarily life can be a struggle, and that anxiety is a normal response in many situations. The situation we find ourselves in currently is an abnormal situation. And so a level of anxiety would be normal for most people. So we wouldn't be saying that if you're experiencing anxiety as a response to COVID, that you have a mental health problem. However, it's important to acknowledge that anxiety may be having an impact on you and how you're able to live your life. We know that there's been an increase in domestic violence due to COVID, and we also know that there's been a recognised increase in the use of alcohol. Manchester University's recent research around suicide doesn't indicate that there have been increased levels of suicide. However, there has been some anecdotal evidence that suicide numbers have increased as a consequence of the present situation we find ourselves in. So I'd be very interested to see the further research that Eric has done around mental health, because I'm sure it will fit into what we're looking at now. So when mental health first aid training was introduced to the College of Social Sciences, it was decided that a number of academics and professional services staff would complete a 2-day training to be mental health first aiders. In addition to that, a number of managers were trained in the half-day mental health awareness workshop. So once that was started, there was an investment in myself becoming a trainer so that we could train staff, an increased number of staff across the college, and also to support the existing staff who were mental health first aiders. This was a different model that was being used in some other universities like York, but we felt that this would be important to ensure that if staff were putting themselves out there as mental health first aiders, that they were also supported. As a consequence of COVID and people working remotely, we've increased the number of resources that are available to staff. So, for instance, we've using the platform of the wellbeing newsletter, we've demonstrated the importance of managing anxiety through blogs, and we've also used the resources available from Mental Health First Aid England, like the Take Your Whole Self to Work, and something that's been mentioned more than once about the importance of connections with other people. We have recently offered a time to connect opportunity to all staff in the college, which is an hour once a week, where people can join a Zoom drop-in meeting to talk about how well they're doing, but also to ask questions of any of the mental health first aiders who are in that Zoom meeting at the time. So what's happened so far with the evaluations that we're continuing to do is that there are an increasing number of staff who have a higher level and understanding of mental health and what mental health is. They've got an increased understanding of the importance of self-care as a consequence of doing the training, but also as a consequence of the things that Sophie was talking about earlier, that Sophie and Dan are leading on with the wellbeing. The importance of listening in an empathic way to colleagues during this difficult time. But also, importantly, the reassurance that you do not have to fix everything. And so a number of managers have been to the mental health awareness sessions. And I think that a lot of people are anxious about asking somebody a question if they think that their mental health is not okay, because they're frightened that they might say something to them that they don't understand and that they're not going to be able to deal with it.
Maureen appears to have frozen on us, so we have our first technical difficulty. We'll see if she joins us again shortly. If not, what I'll do is I'll move into doing my summary, drawing together some of the key points from everyone's presentations so far, from all of the panel, in order to bring us to our Q&A. So Maureen's still not with us. So I think what we'll do is we'll move into the next stage. Of course, if you have questions about Maureen's presentation, specifically about aspects of mental health and the schemes and program of activity that Maureen's been involved in, you can ask them in the Q&A, and hopefully if she's able to rejoin us, we'll be able to direct those toward her. This is evidencing, of course, the practicalities of running these things virtually. You know, it's never as straightforward as it is in person. Although, you know, I can anecdotally give you the evidence that I ran one of these events 3 years ago, face-to-face in the University of Birmingham, and we had a speaker who was unable to attend because their train got cancelled, and subsequently had a fire alarm go off halfway through the event. So the practicalities we face in running these events are seen either way. So by way of a bit of a summary, drawing together some of the points everyone's offered so far, I think it's very much the case that we obviously need to reflect on the context here in terms of discussing the rapid expansion of remote working. Not everyone works remotely, and as Nick mentioned, there's portions of the labour market who are unable to work remotely and will continue to be the case. Nevertheless, our focus here is on thinking about the practicalities of the portion of workers who are remote working. I think one of the distinctions we have in the current application of remote working is that compared to previously, it perhaps less so reflects levels of flexibility in our previous understanding of flexibility. It doesn't reflect an employer agreeing a flexible working arrangement or an ad hoc informal arrangement around working at home some days and working at a workplace or other place of work other days. It instead has been enforced. And of course, that provides a different context for our understanding of remote working. And there's been a lot of discussion today around a number of important aspects of remote working that have come to the fore, I guess, in terms of our thinking of the relationship between remote working and well-being in particular. So I think just to draw some of these together, one of the things that I think is very apparent is that relationships are a central dimension of what we're talking about today. It's been repeated by pretty much all of our panelists along the way, whether that's in the context of trust, whether that's in the context of connecting with one another. It remains an important dimension of work and one that I think is handled in quite a different way when we think about working remotely. Giving is another dimension of work that's been mentioned throughout the discussion today. Obviously, Sophie identified in particular aspects of giving in her presentation, but also Maureen briefly mentioned around even the ideas of people giving an empathetic ear to colleagues. That idea of giving yourself to another. In that sense is an evidence of giving taking place in the workplace. I think another dimension that we've spoken about a lot today is about the physical space and the reality of what is workplace when we're thinking about working remotely in this context. And that might be, a kitchen like I'm stood in, it might be a loft conversion room, it might be a home office, and that might be flexing depending on different situations within households, especially where you have more than one person working at home at any one time. I think another thing that's been evident in discussions today is around the content of jobs and how that might enable or limit the ability of us to perform to a high level when working remotely. Mark mentioned in particular about the idea of autonomy and some of the links that has with trust. And autonomy, of course, is a very interesting component of the properties of our work in terms of driving our motivation and engagement and things like that. I think reflecting on the kind of aspect of flexibility, I think even though the context is very different, that remote working still does offer us a high degree of flexibility in many cases around things like how we engage with our jobs, how we complete tasks, and of course by almost by definition, a lot of the jobs that can be performed remotely offer a greater degree of flexibility in the ways some of the tasks that are completed in those jobs are taken forward. That's not always the case, and again, Mark mentioned about the potential for high levels of monitoring in some forms of remote working, and that can conflict with aspects of autonomy. And I think then, of course, it brings us on to, well, what does this mean for people's careers? And I think linked to some degree to relationships as well. There's ongoing discussion around probably heard my dog in the background. There's ongoing discussion around how we identify and nurture talent in a remote working environment, and how the careers of remote workers may differ to those who work in more traditional environments, thinking about, you know, whether we move to some kind of hybrid model of more workplace alongside remote working, but also, you know, thinking about how you maintain those relationships and identify talent, nurture that talent through things like mentoring and other schemes as well. So I think there's a number of different dimensions we've talked about there that all come together to as a package to think about remote working and indeed well-being. It seems to me that you can't approach this type of subject in a one-dimensional manner. You need to think about all of the different aspects of work and its relationship with well-being in order to arrive at a suitable outcome. Now, I think what I'll do is, before we move into the question and answer section of the event, I think I'll just briefly mention a couple of things I should pay service to. The first is that the event today, one of the drivers of the event today, is an edited book we're putting together that has the same title as the event. It's published by a publisher called IGI in the US. And the second is that this is one of a series of events, of course, that we run through the university and through the Work Inclusivity Research Centre. We run events throughout the year, and of course this year they're taking the form of webinars, and there will be another event later in the year, and the details will be shared about that event with all of those in attendance now afterwards, if that's okay. So without further ado, what we'll do is we'll move into the question and answer section of the event. We've already had a number of questions, so probably if panelists are happy, I will work through questions, and they've all been directed towards someone. So I asked all of the audience members who had a question to direct questions toward people, and what I'll do is I'll just go through the question very briefly, and then I'll invite the panel member to respond to it. So we had a couple of questions that came through on the chat, and then we've had a number of questions that have come through on the question and answer section. So I'll try and manage both. I have to apologize, I'm not good at multitasking. So I'll do the best I can to work through them. Let me have a look. So if we start off, we have a question. So they're kind of not really in any order. There's questions that have come through for different speakers at different points. So I'll just go through them in the order I see them on my list. So we have a question for everyone, in fact, to start us off, which is a nice one. So I can invite anyone to respond. We've had a question around whether the speakers feel that UK employers will be more open to some employees working remotely or flexibly in the long term as a result of the pandemic. You know, so I think that's one. I mean, maybe if I could hand over to Nick actually to respond to that, it'd be quite interesting to see from your perspective, Nick.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think it's a good question. I've got to tell you that in all of the clients that I speak to, apart from one, and that's the UK's National Security Services down at Cheltenham, most have been very keen to have people work remotely during this period if it's possible, and most, I think, envisage a world where there will be a return to a new normal, which will not be the normal that we left. I think people have learned how to delegate, how to trust. They flex some muscles they didn't believe would work during this process. I think that the bigger question is to what extent will they want to do that, and how can they make a hybrid model work, as I was saying earlier on. So I don't think I've got a single client that would say they expect to go back to the way it was. So I think they will have a lot more remote working built into their operating model if their people are able to work remotely.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take the benefit of being the host here and add a bit to that. And I think absolutely. I think one of the things that's very evident in the response by most employers is that they've seen that there are a number of benefits that can be had by movements to greater levels of remote working and used in some form of hybrid model that can offer particular benefits, enabling the maintenance of things like agglomeration benefits, so benefits around people being able to be in the same place as one another, sharing ideas and formally networking, those kind of things, alongside the enhancements that are available from remote working in terms of things like productivity and worker satisfaction. So absolutely. Did anyone else want to jump in and say anything on this?
Yeah, Dan, if I could. I think there will definitely, as Nick says, be a new normal which will be different. And I think one of the things that organisations have learned is that what was considered roles that had to be done in the organisation don't actually have to be. And so there were roles which they didn't believe could be made remote, which can be. But I think the more interesting thing is what skills and knowledge and understanding will people need to be able to work well long term in this new way of working, because it's very different, and it challenges social norms of how we work and how we interact with people. And there's a grave danger that it can actually have negative impacts on people's health, as we've seen, but also, as you were talking about, the benefits of actually those corridor conversations which just happen because you bump into something which can spark something completely new and learning as well. So there's quite a lot of things which we're going to have to learn to do differently when we do move to this way.
I would also throw into that, whilst it helps a lot of our organisations support their sustainability strategies as well, whilst discouraging staff from travelling, it does also throw up questions around equality and diversity. And I think technology poverty and emphasising different people's home setups has caused a different set of issues for organisations that we don't normally have to address.
I mean, there was quite an interesting report today of Deutsche, I think one company which is actually talking about taxing people who work at home because they don't, in other words, reducing their pay because they don't need so much money because they're not paying to travel into work and back, which raises interesting things about the hidden costs of working from home vis-a-vis heating, IT, technology, and so on.
Thanks, everyone. So if we move into the next question, actually, it's directed to you, Mark. So some companies have tasks that are possible to do from a remote work basis, but other activities are not. So there is a question around whether you could talk about this situation and how you deal with a group of employees that don't feel protected in pandemic times in terms of kind of inability to be able to work from home.
I think it's a real problem, and we've actually seen that in the UK situation, that many of the people who have been our key workers have been people who have been traditionally looked upon as being unskilled, low skilled, low paid workers. So there's some quite interesting dynamics going on there. For me, the issue really is that we've as I said earlier, we've discovered quite a few roles which we didn't believe could be undertaken from home, which can. And I think it's much more in the longer term of looking to be able to offer more flexibility in how people work from home, while still maintaining the need where there is a need to have that face-to-face contact within a workplace or service position type situation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would agree with that, Mark. I think my experience with our clients has been, particularly in those where they've not had a model like our own business, where it was fairly easy to move almost 100% of us to remote working, where they've had blue collar workers that needed to be at a particular point of work, or white collar workers that needed to be somewhere, and other staff that didn't. That was a more challenging set of issues for them to deal with. And particularly, I mentioned, I think when I was speaking, some of the big grocers, I know they felt very strongly that if they were asking a large proportion of their shop floor workers to go into work as they were frontline workers, they couldn't really then quite see how they could justify for their managerial and clerical staff in head office how they could be sent working from home, and trying to find a way that seemed fair and that everyone was taking a sort of proportionate sort of impact from it. But I do think there'll be some interesting things, because just as Sophie said earlier on, there are definitely some problems that get caused by some people's ability to work remotely or not, which will be quite an issue for inclusion and diversity. But there are also, I think, some equal and opposite trends, that there are opportunities for people to access work that wasn't necessarily as easy for them to access because of caring responsibilities or disabilities that they can now do remotely. So I think that's why I say I think the future is going to be a really interesting place, but quite challenging, because there's going to be as many pros as there are cons. And, in the hybrid world, we're going to have to navigate many things that we have taken for granted, I think, in terms of the way we treat our people.
Absolutely. And I think with regard to that, now more than ever, businesses that are going to succeed are businesses that are really going to listen to staff and take those issues on board and to adapt much more quickly.
So, Sophie, you've come up with exactly the point I was going to.
Sorry.
No, it's great. It's good, because I mean, it shows we're sort of think about things in interesting ways. And one of the key things that's going to be crucial in the future is the quality of communication and the openness of communication, and being able to show what is happening as to why it's happening, and also thinking about the just nature of it or otherwise in relation to others.
Absolutely. And I think as employers, ensuring we're equipping people with those skills.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said. I think there's a twofold direction here, which is that organisations, of course, need to provide a suitable environment and the relevant structures and culture. But at the same time, there's employees need to take control over their working lives and look at how they can adapt themselves as well to the changes that have happened. So I think it's about individuals and their employers working together for the kind of common goal of adapting to a different way of working that does offer a lot of benefits, and at the same time presents a number of challenges because of the differences that it makes in terms of how we understand work. If I can move on to a question for Sarah. The question here is, it says you talk a bit about the negative effects of contextual collapse and the blurring of social boundaries. So could you talk to maybe some of the positives that could come from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think contextual collapse is one of those interesting things that if you're aware that you're actually engaging with a contextually collapsed environment, and you're able to you've got that awareness of who you're talking to and the people that your information might be reaching, then yes, it can have positives. So from a work perspective, actually having that kind of home and work collide, it can make people look more human, to be honest. It can open the door to people realizing that actually you're not this working machine, you are a very much human person, you have a life outside of work, there are other things going on. And I think maybe one of the things that the pandemic has brought to us is that people have that much more awareness of what's actually going on in other people's lives. It's making people have more empathy with other people's situations. So that's one potential thing. But also in terms of social reach. So if you're engaging in maybe a more socially flat structure, say you've got a Microsoft Teams space, for instance, that has lots of people from across the organization all residing in that one space, you've got the capacity there to reach out to people that maybe you wouldn't normally actually be able to reach, or maybe express your views, express your opinions, get something noticed that you're doing that in normal offline circumstances you wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to speak to those people. So I think, yes, I have talked about quite a few of the negatives, but there are positives as long as you're aware that that contextual collapse is there. I think the danger comes is when people don't have that awareness.
Brilliant, thank you. So if I can offer a question to Eric now. So Eric, did you find gender differences or indeed actually any differences by any other demographics in the responses to your survey you spoke about earlier?
Unmute myself. Yes, I find for the general factors caused by the COVID-19, the men are more likely than women to be more stressful, but not for the working from home. I mean, the two factors from the working from home. So for the general factor about, for example, being fearful of losing their jobs or losing their income or being fearful of catching the virus, the men are more likely to score higher in terms of the stress, the extent of the stress. I think I mean the explanation could be maybe quite clear. I mean it's about, I don't want to talk about potential gender inequality. I mean, this is not something that I don't want to talk about. I want to talk about this. I just thought in many families, it's still quite likely that men are the main person financially to support the family. And this may be one reason why men are more afraid of losing their jobs. And also men may be more than women to see their job as more important to them as a person. If they lose their job, they may feel that they are useless compared to women, possibly. I mean, I just give some possible reason. About catching the virus, I mean, there's some medical evidence showing that men are more likely to die from the virus. I mean, there's also can be the possible reason why men are more likely than women for the general factor, but not for the working from home. For the working from home, there is no significant difference between men and women about the stress caused by working from home. About for example, about seeing the personal life and the working life, being unable to distinguish between each other. Men and women, there are no significant difference between them. Yeah, that's some of my findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That's great. So if I could move on to a question actually for Maureen now. Maureen, sorry we lost you there for a moment, but we're very much interested in what you were telling us. I mean, the question that's come forward is thinking about the move to working from home among academics. Do you think it can help or indeed may result in additional harm in the context of mental health, considering both personal and family aspects of it?
Yeah, that's interesting, and it was on the that was part of what I wanted to talk about, actually, because there are people who have existing mental health issues, and I think that partly what's happened with COVID is that they're not able to use some of the existing strategies that they may have had, and I do apologise for what happened there. That's the first time my internet has gone down since I started working remotely. So so they are not able to use existing strategies, and that's why I think it's really important to look at alternative ways, and also for staff to be colleagues, really, to be aware of how people are within the organisation. So I'm sure that we have all sat in meetings where we can tell somebody isn't quite okay, and then what we do about that, really, in talking to them or having an opportunity to explore what that might be about. So I think for some people it has clearly exacerbated the difficulty, even when I think someone mentioned earlier on that in the beginning, many people were quite pleased, or they were looking forward to working remotely. And then some of the strategies that they might have had in place, they haven't been able to use in the same way. So I think that we have a responsibility as an organisation to ensure that people have an opportunity to talk about their mental health. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that, stigma is still out there when it comes to mental health. So some people are still reluctant to talk about existing mental health issues because of the fear of what might happen to them. But what I do recognise, certainly within COS, is that there is an opportunity for it to become more visible, but I think we're still in the early stages of that. Now, I don't know whether that answers the question, but if anybody wants me to expand on it, I can.
I think there's also a really interesting resource, Maureen. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a Harvard Business Review article that looks at personality types along Myers-Briggs and how they cope with this situation and the always on technology and working remotely that's worth a look. Because I think academics are one group, but it affects all sorts of different people. And I would suggest it's more probably in line with that and the personality types of people and how they cope, along with the home situation and all those other areas.
Yeah, I think as well that academics can sometimes work in silos, and they're not always as open to working within groups as other disciplines are. So I do think there is a potentially an increased risk of their mental health being affected.
Thanks, Maureen. So if I can just go through just 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up, because we did plan to end at 12:30. So if I can just offer a question actually out to everyone, as we move forward into what we've been termed by the question here, more productive times. What do you think the key features will be of the future of working? Do you think it'll be flexibility, work from home, or something else? If anyone wants to respond to that one.
I'll have a go at that. So I think the key feature will, as you say, be both flexibility and a multitude of different models that different organizations will deploy. Because if I'm honest, I think there are a huge number of positives that have come out of this forced experiment of working from home. You know, we've learned how to use technology that people were, you know, certainly in our organization, we've had video conferencing facilities and on your laptop for years. And, you know, I suspect the penetration was about 3% compared to now it's 100%. Now, I don't think it will stay at 100% because I think, you know, we have a lot of people who, you know, love to spend the time actually with their clients, with their colleagues. There's a huge collaborative and creative process in some of the things that we do. And there's also some times where people need some peace and quiet. And frankly, our big open plan offices with collaboration space is not great for people who want peace and quiet to sit at a computer or do some thinking, etc. So, you know, I think we'll have to find those new ways of working. But I think that's going to be the challenge, is how you orchestrate all those different subgroups and the need to get the benefit you have out of lots of skills in an organization and lots of collaboration, which is where creativity and innovation come from. How you create the times for that to happen, but you also create the spaces so that you don't sort of have one day a week that's called collaboration day, and that's the day you've got to be in the office to collaborate, and the rest of the time you can sort of do what you want. I think that's going to be much harder, I think, for organizations to orchestrate. I also think that the point that was just touched on just now, that certainly in my rather simplistic way, I think there's a lot of stuff that happens when you're at work, you know, when you are at somewhere else, whether it's your place of work or your clients' or customers' place of work, but it's not your home and it's not the coffee table in Starbucks or wherever else you got used to working. There's a lot of stuff that happens there that no one's planned. It's, you know, as Mark was saying, that those corridor conversations, the unplanned discussions, the little snippets of ideas that get floated, that's one thing. But also there's a whole load of, you know, on-the-job training, on-the-job learning, coaching, developing, you know, cultural norms, good and bad, I suspect, probably, but, you know, certainly some good ones that happen almost by osmosis. No one sort of planned them. They just happen because of what's the imbalances that are there. And I think it's going to be quite hard for us to think about what those are and plan for them. You know, the whole idea of a sort of planned hour of spontaneity doesn't really fit well with me. You know, spontaneity happens in a spontaneous way. So I think that's going to be the other big difference. And so I think actually the orchestration of work, rather than relying on all these people to sort of you know, travel miles on a bus or a plane or a car or whatever to go into a place of work, you know, the orchestration of that is going to be much harder and need much more thought, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I think that actually answered another 2 of the questions, which is excellent. So that was a very comprehensive point put forward. Yeah, and so if I can now, I'm just conscious we ran a little bit over. So I would really like to thank everyone who's taken part in the panel today, all of our panelists. I would like to thank Kelly, who's organised the event for us behind the scenes and done an excellent job. And I'd like to thank everyone who's been in attendance today. There's been some excellent questions. You've all behaved, it's been a you know, hopefully an enjoyable and informative event, and one that sets you thinking about what the future of work might look like post-COVID. So if I might just you know, remind you, we will contact you after the event just with a very brief piece of information about another event that will be taking place soon if you are interested, another webinar that looks at flexible working in a different dimension, and we'll remind you of the fact that we have also putting together an edited book along the lines of the topic of this seminar. So do go and buy a copy. It will answer all your questions about what the future of work is going to look like. So again, thank you all. Thanks for all being in attendance today, and thanks just one last time for all of our panelists today. You've been excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.